A dying millionaire, abandoned by his own family, finds unexpected comfort in a homeless little girl who knocks on his door for food. But when he passes away, a shocking decision in his will turns everything upside down and reveals a truth no one saw coming. What happened in those final days that changed everything? If you were curious, stay with the story till the end. Don't forget to subscribe for more meaningful stories like this. By the way, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? And hey, take care of your health too, okay? Alexander Grant woke before the sun had fully risen, not because he wanted to, but because sleep had slowly become something that no longer belongs to him. The room around him was quiet, too quiet for a house this large. Years ago, the silence had felt like peace, like a reward for everything he had built. Now it pressed against his chest in a way that made breathing feel heavier than it should have been. He lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint ticking of the antique clock on the wall. It had been a gift from a business partner decades ago, back when his name still meant something more than numbers on a bank account. He turned his head slightly toward the window. The curtains were half open and a pale wash of morning light spilled into the room, soft and indifferent. Another day, he thought. Another day closer to the end. The doctors had told him clearly, with that careful tone people use when they don't want to sound cruel, 6 months, maybe less if his body gave in faster than expected. He had nodded at the time, even managed a small smile, as if they had just told him the weather forecast. But the truth was, it hadn't fully settled in until mornings like this, when there was nothing to distract him from the weight of it. Slowly he pushed himself upright. His body resisted in small, stubborn ways, his hands trembling slightly, his chest tightening as if reminding him of its limits. He sat at the edge of the bed for a moment, catching his breath, then reached for the neatly pressed shirt that had been laid out the night before. Even now he maintained habits of order, of control. It was one of the few things he could still hold on to. The mansion stretched out around him like a museum of his own life. 15 rooms, each filled with something expensive, something rare, something that had once felt like proof that he had made it. Marble floors that echoed under his steps, paintings he had bought at auctions without ever truly looking at them again. A dining table large enough for a dozen people that had not been used for a real meal in years. Everything was perfect. Everything was untouched. Everything was empty. He moved slowly down the staircase, his hand gripping the polished railing. There had been a time when he used to take these steps 2 at a time, late for meetings, phone pressed to his ear, mind racing with deals and numbers and possibilities. Back then the house had been alive, voices, laughter, arguments, doors opening and closing. Now even his footsteps seemed too loud, as if the house itself was reminding him that it no longer belonged to anyone but him. In the kitchen, a small breakfast had already been prepared by the staff, toast, eggs, coffee. Everything arranged perfectly, as always. He sat down, stared at it for a moment, then reached for the coffee. It had gone slightly cold, but he drank it anyway. The food remained untouched. Lately eating felt more like a responsibility than a desire. His phone rested on the table beside him. He glanced at it once, then again, as if expecting something appear if he looked long enough. No messages, no missed calls. He had told himself not to expect anything, but habit was a difficult thing to break. His daughter used to call him every Sunday when she was younger, her voice bright and full of excitement over the smallest things. Now weeks passed without a word unless she needed money transferred. His son was no different, except more direct, less patient, as if everything his father owned already belonged to him. Alexander picked up the phone and scrolled through old messages, short conversations, mostly about transactions, requests, confirmations. "No, how are you? No, I miss you." He paused on an older message, one from years ago. "Happy birthday, Dad. Love you." He stared at it longer than he meant to, then locked the screen and set the phone down again. It wasn't always like this, or maybe it was and he just hadn't noticed. He had spent most of his life building something, his business, his reputation, his fortune. Late nights turned into early mornings, meetings replaced dinners, and success quietly took the place of presence. At the time, it had felt necessary. He had told himself he was doing it for them, for their future, for a life they would never have to struggle through. And he had succeeded. He had given them everything except himself. Now, sitting alone in a house too large for one person, he wondered when exactly things had changed. When did conversations turn into transactions? When did family become something that only existed on paper? He couldn't pinpoint the moment, and somehow that made it worse. He stood up and walked toward the large window overlooking the front gate. The street beyond was already alive, cars passing, people walking, a mother holding her child's hand as they crossed the road. There was movement, connection, life. He pressed his palm lightly against the glass, feeling the faint coolness against his skin. I built all of this, he murmured quietly, more to himself than anyone else. And for what? The question lingered in the air unanswered. He had asked it before, in different forms at different times, but never as honestly as now. Money had once felt like a solution, a way to fix things, to provide, to protect. But there were things it couldn't reach, things it couldn't repair once they were gone. Behind him the house remained silent. No footsteps, no voices, no signs of life beyond his own slow breathing. He turned away from the window and walked back toward the living room, each step measured, each movement deliberate. Today was his 65th birthday. He didn't say it out loud. There was no one to say it to. For a brief moment, a small, almost foolish thought crossed his mind. Maybe someone would remember this time. Maybe there would be a call, a message, a knock on the door. Sunny thing. He allowed himself to hold on to that thought for a few seconds longer than he should have, then let it go with a quiet exhale. Alexander lowered himself into his favorite chair by the window, the same chair he had sat in countless evenings, watching the world move on without him. The sunlight had grown stronger now, filling the room with a soft glow that made everything look warmer than it felt. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but simply to rest from the weight of being awake. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by everything he had ever worked for, Alexander Grant felt something he had never truly allowed himself to feel before, not fear of death, but fear of leaving the world exactly as he had lived in it these past few years alone. The afternoon had settled into a quiet stillness that seemed to stretch endlessly across the estate. Alexander remained in his chair by the window, watching shadows slowly shift across the marble floor. Time felt different these days, slower, heavier, as if each hour had to be carried rather than lived. He hadn't moved much since morning. The untouched breakfast still sat somewhere behind him, likely cold by now, but he hadn't bothered to check. Hunger came and went without much meaning anymore. What stayed was the silence. It was sometime past midday when something unusual caught his attention. At first it was just movement beyond the gate, nothing extraordinary, just a small figure lingering where most people simply passed by. He wouldn't have noticed at all if the figure hadn't stopped. People didn't stop in front of his house. They glanced, maybe slowed for a second to admire the size of it, then continued on with their lives. But this one stayed. Alexander leaned forward slightly, narrowing his eyes as he tried to focus. It was a child, no smaller than he expected. A girl, maybe 10 or 11 at most. She stood just outside the iron gate, one hand lightly gripping the bars as if unsure whether she was allowed to be that close. Her clothes were worn thin, faded to a color that no longer had a name. Her shoes didn't match, one looked too big, the other barely holding together. Even from a distance, he could see how still she stood, like someone gathering courage, one breath at a time. He told himself she would leave. That was what usually happened. People hesitated, reconsidered, then moved on. But she didn't. Instead, after a long moment, she pushed the gate open just enough to slip through, as if afraid it might make a sound and give her away. Alexander felt something shift in his chest, something small but unfamiliar, curiosity maybe, or something deeper that he hadn't felt in a long time. He watched as she walked slowly up the driveway, each step careful, uncertain. She wasn't looking around the way most children would in a place like this. There was no excitement, no wonder, only hesitation, and something else he recognized too well, caution. The doorbell rang soft but clear. For a moment, he didn't move. Visitors were rare enough that the sound itself felt almost foreign. His first instinct was to ignore it. That would have been easier, simpler. But the image of the girl standing outside lingered in his mind. And before he could convince himself otherwise, he was already on his feet, moving toward the door. When he opened it, she was standing exactly where he had imagined, small, thin, her hands clasped together tightly as if holding herself in place. Up close, the details were impossible to ignore. Dirt marked her arms and cheeks, not in careless smudges but in the kind that came from days, maybe weeks, without proper washing. Her hair was tangled, unevenly cut, as though someone had tried to take care of it once and then stopped. But it was her eyes that held him still. They weren't empty, they weren't even defeated. They were alert, searching, quietly hopeful in a way that didn't quite belong in a child who had clearly seen too much. "Sir," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she wasn't sure she had the right to be heard. "I'm sorry to bother you." Alexander said nothing at first. He simply looked at her, taking in the way she shifted her weight slightly from one foot to the other, the way her fingers tightened together. She wasn't begging in the way he had seen before. There was no practiced tone, no rehearsed plea, just uncertainty. "I was wondering," she continued, then hesitated, swallowing before trying again. "Do you maybe have some food? Just a little. Anything is okay." Simple, direct, no exaggeration, no performance, just truth. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, the words didn't pass through him the way they normally would have. In the past, he might have reached into his wallet, handed her some cash, and closed the door without another thought. It would have been efficient, detached, done. But something about her, about the way she asked, about the way she stood there not expecting anything, made that response feel insufficient. "What's your name?" he asked instead, his voice quieter than usual. The question seemed to catch her off guard. She blinked once, as if she hadn't expected it. "Lily," she said after a second. He nodded slowly. "Lily," he repeated it, not out of habit, but as if trying to understand it. Then after a brief pause, he stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come in." Her eyes widened immediately. "Sir," she glanced down at her clothes, at her shoes, as if suddenly aware of every detail that didn't belong in a place like this. "I'm really dirty. I don't want to mess anything up." Alexander almost smiled. It was a small, fleeting expression, but it was real. "This house has survived worse than a bit of dirt," he said. "You'll be fine." She hesitated for a moment longer, then stepped inside carefully, as if the floor itself might reject her. Her movements were slow, deliberate, her gaze lowered. He noticed how she avoided touching anything unnecessarily, how she kept her hands close to herself. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward a chair in the kitchen. She obeyed immediately, perching on the edge rather than settling into it, as if ready to leave at any second. Alexander moved toward the counter, opening the refrigerator. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking at the abundance of food neatly arranged inside. He hadn't noticed it before, not really. It had always just been there, something expected. But now, with Lily sitting quietly behind him, it felt different, excessive even. He began taking things out: bread, soup, fruit, whatever was easy to prepare. His movements were slower than they used to be, but steady enough. When he placed the plate in front of her, she stared at it for a second, as if unsure whether it was real. "You can eat," he said gently. That was all it took. She picked up the spoon carefully at first, almost politely, but the moment she tasted the food, something changed. Not in a dramatic way. She didn't suddenly rush or lose control, but there was a quiet urgency now. A hunger she was trying to contain out of respect. Alexander sat across from her, watching. Not in judgment, not in pity, but in a way he hadn't watched anyone in a long time, with attention. After a few moments, Lily paused and looked up at him. "Aren't you going to eat too?" she asked. The question was simple, almost automatic, but it caught him off guard more than anything else had that day. It had been a long time since anyone had asked him that. Not about business, not about money, not about what he could give, but about whether he was eating. Whether he was taking care of himself. He glanced down at the table, then back at her. "I will," he said after a moment, and for once he meant it. By the time evening approached, the house no longer felt as empty as it had that morning. It wasn't that anything had changed physically. The walls were still silent, the rooms still vast, but there was a presence now, something subtly undeniable. Lily had eaten slowly, carefully, as if trying to stretch the moment for as long as possible. Afterward, she had offered to help clean, despite clearly not knowing where anything belonged. Alexander had waved it off at first, but she insisted in a quiet, respectful way that he found difficult to refuse. Now she sat across from him in the living room, her legs tucked slightly under the chair, holding a glass of water with both hands. The late afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow across the space. It was the kind of moment that might have felt ordinary to anyone else, but to Alexander, it felt unfamiliar in the best way, like something he had forgotten he needed. "So do you live here alone?" Lily asked after a while, her voice tentative but curious. Alexander leaned back slightly in his chair. "Yes," he said, "I do." She nodded as if that answer made sense to her. "It's really big," she added, glancing around again, though not with awe this time, more with quiet observation. "It is," he replied. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just natural. Lily didn't rush to fill it, and neither did he. That alone felt different. Most conversations in his life had always been about something: goals, deals, expectations. This one simply existed. Then, just as he was about to say something else, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the stillness. Alexander's body stiffened almost immediately. He didn't need to look to know who it was. The timing alone told him everything. Lily noticed the change in him. "Is someone here?" she asked quietly. He exhaled slowly. "Yes," he said, "my family." The word felt strange as it left his mouth. Before he could say anything more, the front door opened without a knock. Voices filled the hallway, familiar, loud, carrying a kind of energy that didn't belong in the calm that had settled just moments before. "Dad," a woman's voice called out, "we here." Janet entered first, dressed impeccably as always, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Behind her came her brother, Daniel, scrolling through his phone, barely looking up. Their uncle Richard followed last, carrying a small gift bag that looked more like an afterthought than anything meaningful. They stopped when they saw Lily. For a brief second no one spoke. Then Janet's expression shifted, her brows tightening as her gaze moved from the girl to her father. "Who is that?" she asked, her tone already edged with suspicion. Alexander didn't respond immediately. He stood up slowly, his posture straightening despite the fatigue in his body. "This is Lily," he said. "She's my guest." "Your guest," Daniel repeated, finally looking up from his phone. His eyes moved over Lily quickly, taking in her clothes, her posture, everything. His expression hardened almost instantly. "Dad," he didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Lily shrank slightly in her seat, her fingers tightening around the glass in her hands. Richard stepped forward, his voice lower but no less judgmental. "Alexander, you can't just bring someone like this into your home. You don't know where she's been." Something in Alexander snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly. "I know exactly where she's been," he said. "She was outside, hungry, so I invited her in." Janet let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Dad, that's not the point. You don't just trust strangers like that. What if she's here to steal something or worse?" Lily flinched at the word steal, her eyes dropping to the floor. "I didn't," she started softly, but her voice faltered. "No one asked you," Janet cut in sharply. "Enough." The word came from Alexander, quiet but heavy. It carried more weight than any raised voice could have. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. It wasn't peaceful, it was tense, stretched thin. "She hasn't done anything wrong," Alexander continued, his gaze fixed on his children. "She asked for food. I gave it to her. That's all." "That's not all," Daniel said, stepping closer now. "You let her inside, into the house. Do you have any idea how irresponsible that is?" Alexander met his son's gaze steadily. "Do you have any idea how cruel you sound right now?" Daniel scoffed, shaking his head. "We were trying to protect you." "From what?" Alexander asked, kindness. No one answered. Lily stood up slowly, her movements hesitant. "I think I should go," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." She kept her eyes down as she spoke, as if already expecting to be told to leave. Alexander turned toward her immediately. "You not causing trouble," he said. "You staying?" "Dad," Janet began, but he raised a hand, stopping her. "I said she's staying." There was something different in his voice now, something final. But Daniel wasn't ready to let it go. He walked toward Lily, his presence looming in a way that made her instinctively step back. "Look," he said, his tone colder now. "Whatever you trying to do here, it's not going to work. You need to leave." "I'm not trying to do anything," Lily said, her voice trembling but honest. "He just gave me food, that's all." "Yeah, I'm sure," Daniel muttered. Before he could say anything else, Alexander stepped between them. The movement cost him more effort than he wanted to show, but he didn't hesitate. "That's enough," he said again, this time more firmly. "You don't get to speak to her like that." For a moment, father and son stood facing each other, neither backing down. It was Richard who broke the tension, his voice softer but no less cutting. "Alexander, think about what you were doing. This isn't normal. You were letting a stranger come between you and your own family." Alexander let out a quiet breath. "No," he said, "what's not normal is the way you all acting right now." He looked at each of them in turn, his expression steady, almost tired but clear. "She came here with nothing, and she showed more respect in 1 hour than any of you have in years." The words landed harder than he intended, but he didn't take them back. Janet's face flushed with anger. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" he asked. "When was the last time you sat with me like this? When was the last time you asked me if I'd eaten?" No one spoke. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt heavier, filled with things that had been left unsaid for far too long. Lily stood quietly off to the side, unsure where to look, unsure whether she even belonged in this moment. But one thing was clear, even to her, this wasn't just about her. It never had been. Alexander straightened slightly, though the effort showed now in the way his shoulders tightened. "If you can't treat her with basic decency," he said, his voice calm but firm, "then you can leave." The words hung in the air, simple and absolute. And in that moment, the lines were drawn not between a rich man and a poor girl, but between what was real and what had only ever pretended to be. The house felt different after that night. Not immediately, not in any dramatic way, but in the quiet details that only someone like Alexander would notice. The echo in the hallway didn't sound as hollow anymore. The evenings, which used to stretch endlessly, now had shape to them. And somehow, despite his condition worsening day by day, there was a strange sense of steadiness in his life that hadn't existed in years. Lily stayed. At first, it was only meant to be temporary, a night, maybe 2. That's what Alexander had told himself. But the next morning came, and she was still there, sitting quietly at the kitchen table, waiting for him to wake up, as if she had always belonged in that space. She didn't touch anything without asking. She didn't wander into rooms uninvited. She moved carefully, respectfully, like someone who understood that what she had been given could be taken away at any moment. Alexander noticed everything. The way she folded the blanket after sleeping on the edge of the bed instead of using it fully, as if she didn't deserve the comfort. The way she ate slower than before, not because she wasn't hungry, but because she was trying to show restraint. The way she watched him when she thought he wasn't looking, quietly making sure he was okay. It unsettled him at first, not in a negative way, but in a way that forced him to confront things he had ignored for too long. No one had watched him like that in years, not with concern, not without expectation. His health declined steadily. There was no sudden collapse, no dramatic moment, just small changes that added up. He grew weaker. Walking from one room to another took more effort than it should have. Some mornings even getting out of bed felt like negotiating with his own body. The doctors had warned him, but experiencing it was something else entirely. And yet he was no longer alone in it. Lily adapted without being asked. She learned his routine quickly, what time he usually woke up, which medications he needed, how he preferred his tea. She didn't do things perfectly, but she did them with care, and that made all the difference. If he forgot to take his medicine, she would gently remind him. If he tried to push himself too far, she would notice before he admitted it. "You should sit," she would say sometimes, her voice soft but certain. "I'm fine," he would reply out of habit. She would tilt her head slightly, studying him in a way that felt almost too perceptive for her age. "You don't look fine," she would answer simply. And more often than not, he would sit. They fell into a rhythm that neither of them questioned. Mornings were quiet tea, sometimes a small breakfast if he could manage it. Afternoons were spent in the garden when the weather allowed it. Lily liked the garden. She didn't say much about it, but he could tell. She would walk slowly along the paths, occasionally stopping to look at a flower as if it were something rare and important. "Did you plant all of these?" she asked once. "No," he said. "I paid someone else to." She nodded, thinking about that. "They were still nice," she said after a moment. That made him smile more than it should have. Evenings were their longest time together. Sometimes she would read aloud from one of the many books in his library. She stumbled over certain words, paused to sound them out, occasionally looked at him for help. He would correct her gently, never impatient. Other times they simply talked. Not about anything grand or important, just small things. Her memories of school before she stopped going. The places she used to sleep. The strange, fleeting kindness of strangers she had encountered. He found himself telling stories, two things he hadn't spoken about in years. His early days when he had nothing but determination and a stubborn refusal to fail. The mistakes he had made. The deals that nearly ruined him before they made him. And sometimes, without fully intending to, he spoke about his family not with anger, but with a quiet kind of disappointment that had settled deep over time. One evening, after a long silence between stories, he looked at her and said, almost to himself, "I thought I was building something that would last." Lily didn't respond right away. She rarely rushed her answers. "Maybe you still did," she said eventually. He frowned slightly. "It doesn't feel like it." She shrugged, a small, thoughtful movement. "Not everything that lasts is big," she said. "Some things are just people." He didn't reply, but the words stayed with him longer than he expected. It was around that time that he made the decision. Not impulsively, not out of emotion alone, but with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He had spent his entire life deciding where things should go: money, investments, opportunities. This was no different. It just mattered more. He called his lawyer a few days later. Edward Miller had with him for over 2 decades, a man who understood both his business and, to some extent, the man behind it. When Edward arrived, he seemed surprised to see Lily, though he said nothing at first. He simply observed, the way a careful man always does. "I want to update my will," Alexander said once they were seated. Edward nodded slowly. "I assumed that might happen," he replied, "given your current situation." Alexander didn't bother with formalities. "I'm leaving everything to her," he said, glancing briefly toward Lily, who was sitting quietly across the room, trying not to interrupt. Edward followed his gaze, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he looked back at Alexander. "Your children won't accept that easily," he said. "I'm not asking them to accept it," Alexander replied. There was no hesitation in his voice. That was what made Edward pause. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Yes." The conversation that followed was detailed, practical, grounded in legality and consequences. Alexander listened carefully, asked the necessary questions, made sure everything was clear. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was a decision he intended to stand. When Edward left, the house returned to its usual quiet. Lily looked at him unsure. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked softly. Alexander shook his head. "No," he said. "You did something right." She didn't fully understand what he meant, but she didn't press further. Days continued to pass, each one bringing him closer to the inevitable. His strength faded more noticeably now. There were moments when speaking took effort, when even sitting upright felt like too much. But through it all, Lily remained. Not out of obligation, not out of expectation, but because she chose to. And for the first time in a very long time, Alexander no longer felt like he was facing the end alone. The night Alexander died was quieter than anyone would have expected. There were no dramatic final words, no sudden rush of chaos, just a slow fading, like a candle that had burned for too long finally giving in to the dark. Lily had been sitting beside him for hours, her small hand wrapped gently around his, as if holding on could somehow keep him there a little longer. The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp near the bed, casting soft shadows that moved slightly whenever the night air slipped through the open window. His breathing had been uneven for a while, each breath a little shallower than the last. Lily didn't fully understand what was happening, not in a medical sense, but she understood enough. She had seen people struggle before, had seen what it looked like when someone's body was too tired to keep going. But this felt different. This wasn't just someone. This was him. "Are you okay?" she had asked at one point, her voice barely steady. Alexander had opened his eyes slowly, as if it took effort just to meet her gaze. There was no fear in them, only a kind of quiet acceptance that Lily didn't know how to process. "I am," he said softly. "Don't worry." But she did worry. She had been worrying for days, maybe longer, ever since she realized that no matter how much she helped, she couldn't stop what was coming. She could make him comfortable, she could stay by his side, but she couldn't change the ending. He squeezed her hand gently, or at least tried to. "You were going to be okay," he murmured. Lily shook her head immediately, tears already forming in her eyes. "You don't know that." He gave the smallest hint of a smile. "I do," he said, "because you're stronger than you think." She wanted to argue, to say something that would make him stay, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just held on tighter, as if that was the only thing she could still do. Not long after that, his breathing slowed even more, until it became so quiet she almost thought he had fallen asleep. She leaned closer, watching carefully, waiting for the next breath. It came, but softer, then another, and then nothing. For a moment, Lily didn't move. She just sat there, her hand still holding his, her mind refusing to catch up with what had just happened. The silence in the room felt heavier than anything she had ever known. "Mr. Alexander," she whispered, as if he might still answer. He didn't. The realization didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, painfully, until it settled into something she couldn't ignore. Her grip tightened for a second, then loosened as her shoulders began to shake. She didn't cry loudly. There were no dramatic sobs, no desperate calls for help, just quiet tears falling one after another as she sat there beside him, not ready to let go. When morning came, everything began to move again, whether she was ready or not. The lawyer arrived first, his expression already heavy with understanding. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. He didn't say things that didn't need to be said. He simply handled what needed to be handled, with a calm that Lily found strangely comforting. "You don't have to go through this alone," he told her at one point, his voice gentle but firm. She nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed it yet. News spread quickly after that. It didn't take long for Alexander's children to arrive, their presence filling the house in a way that immediately erased the quiet peace that had existed just hours before. They moved through the rooms with urgency, their grief loud, almost overwhelming, but something about it didn't feel real to Lily. Maybe it was the way they spoke to each other, already discussing arrangements, already asking about documents and assets. Maybe it was just the way they looked at her. "What is she still doing here?" Daniel asked, his voice sharp the moment he saw her. Lily stood still, unsure whether to answer. "She was with your father," the lawyer said before she could speak. "Until the end." Janet crossed her arms, her expression cold. "That doesn't mean she belongs here." Lily felt the familiar urge to shrink, to disappear, but she stayed where she was. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because leaving felt wrong. "She's not going anywhere," the lawyer said calmly. "Not until everything is settled." That was the first time Lily realized something was different. Not just about the situation, but about her place in it. The reading of the will happened a few days later, in a room that suddenly felt too small for everything it was about to hold. The atmosphere was tense, thick with expectation. Janet and Daniel sat across from the lawyer, their expressions controlled but restless. Lily sat quietly to the side, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The lawyer opened the document, his movements precise, deliberate. He read through the formalities first, the legal language that seemed to stretch on forever. No one interrupted, but the impatience in the room was obvious. And then he reached the part that mattered. "To my children," he read, his voice steady, "I leave my acknowledgement, but not my estate." The words landed heavily, though no one reacted immediately. "My assets, properties, and all associated holdings are to be transferred in full to Lily Carter." Silence. For a second it felt like time had stopped completely. Then everything broke at once. "This is ridiculous," Janet snapped, standing up so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "There's no way this is valid." "He was manipulated," Daniel added, his voice rising. "There's no other explanation." Lily didn't move. She barely breathed. The words echoed in her mind, but they didn't fully make sense yet. The lawyer remained calm. "The will is legally binding," he said. "Your father was of sound mind when he made this decision." "That's impossible," Janet said. "He wouldn't do this to us." The lawyer paused for a moment before responding. "He did." The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't shock, it was anger. Lily could feel their eyes on her, sharp and accusing, but she didn't look up. She didn't defend herself. She didn't argue. Because deep down, she knew something they didn't. This wasn't about money. It never had been. In the days that followed, things didn't magically become easy. There were legal processes, challenges, conversations she didn't fully understand. There were moments when she felt completely overwhelmed, when the weight of everything pressed down on her in ways she wasn't prepared for. But she wasn't alone. The lawyer stayed involved, guiding her through each step, making sure she wasn't taken advantage of. Slowly, things began to settle. The house remained, but it no longer felt like something distant or unreachable. It became something she could walk through without hesitation, something she could exist in without feeling out of place. And yet, despite everything that had changed, some things didn't. She still remembered what it felt like to be hungry. She still remembered what it meant to have nowhere to go. And she didn't forget the promise she had made, not out loud, but in the quiet space between her thoughts. One afternoon, standing in the garden where she and Alexander used to sit, she looked around at everything he had left behind. Not just the house, not just the wealth, but the chance to do something with it. "I'll do it right," she said softly, more to him than to herself. "I won't waste it." There was no answer, of course. But for the first time since he was gone, the silence didn't feel so heavy. What stayed with me the most after this story wasn't the twist of the will, or even the dramatic conflict with the family. It was something much quieter. It was the uncomfortable realization that loneliness doesn't always come from having nothing, but sometimes from having everything except the right people. Alexander had built a life that looked complete from the outside, but in the end, what he truly needed was something simple as someone who cared whether he had eaten, someone who chose to stay. Lily, on the other hand, had nothing in terms of material value, yet she carried something far more rare, genuine kindness without expectation. And that contrast is what makes the story feel real. It's not trying to say that money is bad or that family is always selfish, but it does quietly question what we often take for granted. Who actually shows up? Who stays when there's nothing to gain? I think what makes this story human is that no one is entirely unrealistic. The children aren't villains in a cartoon sense. They feel like people who slowly lost their sense of connection, maybe without even noticing when it happened. And Alexander isn't perfect either. There's a quiet implication that he might have contributed to that distance over the years. That makes everything feel more grounded, more believable. But in the end, the story isn't really about punishment or reward. It's about recognition. Alexander, before he dies, finally sees clearly who truly cares and what actually matters. And Lily, in a way, represents a second chance, not for him to fix his past, but to pass something meaningful forward. What I take from it is simple, but not easy. Love isn't proven by what you give when it's convenient, but by how you show up when it isn't. And sometimes, the people who matter most in our lives won't be the ones we expect. They'll be the ones who choose us, quietly, without reason.